She didn't cry. That was the thing nobody understood afterward. When the police came to the door of the Ashford Crane estate in West Vancouver, when the cameras were pointed at her face, when Margot Hale stood on that driveway in her nurse's scrubs with her hands still shaking, she didn't cry. She looked straight into the lens, and she said, "You should have listened to her when she was asking nicely. That was the end. This is the beginning." 6 weeks before that morning, Margot Hale stepped off the C-bus in North Vancouver with a backpack, a folded reference letter from St. Paul's Hospital, and the particular kind of exhaustion that only comes from starting over somewhere you once swore you'd never return. She was 31 years old. She'd done 2 years in palliative care in Toronto, another year doing home health in Winnipeg, and somewhere between the two she'd learned the difference between a patient who was fading and a patient who was being pushed toward the edge by the people who were supposed to love them. She didn't always know what to do with that knowledge. In Winnipeg, she'd reported a family once, filed the forms, gave the statements, sat across from a social worker in a beige office, and explained what she'd seen. The patient was moved. The daughter stopped speaking to her. The family filed a complaint with the nursing college that took 8 months to resolve and cost Margot 2 contracts and 1 reference she'd been counting on. She wasn't bitter. Not exactly. She'd just gotten precise. The position was listed through a private care agency. Live-in nurse, 1 patient, estate in West Vancouver. The patient was Elspeth Crane, 79 years old, former professor of environmental law at UBC, retired 12 years, now managing a degenerative joint condition that had taken her mobility in stages the way a tide takes a shoreline. Slowly, then all at once. Still sharp, still reading. Still sending emails to former students who were now judges and cabinet ministers. Still fighting, in other words. Just from a wheelchair. The man who hired Margot was named Sutton Crane, Elspeth's son. 44 Patagonia vest, the kind of handshake that's meant to close a room. He ran the family's real estate development firm. He met Margot in a glass-walled office overlooking Burrard Inlet and gave her a binder. He said, "My mother's needs are complex." She said, "I've read the intake form." He said, "She can be difficult," she said. "Most people who've spent their lives being right are." Something moved behind his eyes, not a smile. The calculation that happens when someone realizes they've underestimated you. He said, "You start Monday." The estate was on a cul-de-sac above the water. The house was glass and old cedar, built in the 70s, added to carefully over 50 years. The garden had been Elspeth's project before the mobility went. You could tell by the way the beds were laid. Not decorative. Intentional. Fruit trees along the south wall, native species in the borders, a rain garden in the corner that Margot would later learn Elspeth had designed herself in 2004 as part of a municipal pilot program, the kind of garden that told you something about the person who planned it. Elspeth was in the solarium when Margot arrived, wheelchair facing the window, the North Shore mountains filling the glass, a book open across her lap. White hair cut short, reading glasses pushed up on her forehead, a face that had spent decades being unimpressed by people who expected her to be easier. She didn't look up right away. She said, "Sit down." Margot sat. She said, "They sent me 3 nurses before you. First one talked to me like I was already gone. Second one looked at me like I was already gone. Third one I liked, but she moved to Halifax." Margot said, "What happened to the first 2? Now Elspeth looked up. The glasses came down from her forehead. She said, "I told Sutton to let them go." Margot said, "Good." That was all. Elspeth went back to her book. Margot looked around the solarium, at the shelves of environmental law journals and indigenous land rights scholarship, at the handwritten note on a post-it stuck to the window frame that said, in cramped, emphatic letters, "Citation needed." She thought, "I can work with this." The first 2 weeks were orientation. Elspeth tested everyone who came into her orbit, not unkindly, not cruelly, but with the relentless precision of a woman who'd spent her career identifying weak arguments. She'd ask Margot questions in the middle of medication rounds, just to see if Margot would stop what she was doing to answer. She'd change her mind about meals 3 times between breakfast and lunch. She'd ask for a book and then not want it and then want it again in an hour. Margot understood. She'd seen it before in palliative care especially. When your body stops being yours, control becomes a language. You speak it wherever you can. By the end of week 2, they had a rhythm. Mornings, Elspeth read case law from her former students' decisions. She annotated in the margins of printed copies like she was still grading. Sometimes she read passages aloud to Margot, not explaining, just sharing. Margot would listen from wherever she was in the room, folding laundry, checking the medication log. On the fourth day, Elspeth said, "Do you have an opinion about the Blueberry River decision?" Margot said, "I think the judge was right, but the remedy was too small." Elspeth took her glasses off and looked at her properly for the first time. She said, "Explain." Margot sat down and explained. They argued for 45 minutes. Elspeth won. Margot made her a point she hadn't considered, and Elspeth wrote it in the margin of her printout in red pen. That was how it was between them after that. Not warm, not yet, but real. Sutton's partner was named Imogen. She arrived on the 11th day, which meant she'd been in Margot's peripheral awareness, before Margot fully registered her. A voice on the phone through closed doors. A cashmere jacket draped over the banister. A specific kind of floral perfume that always lingered in the hallway long after she'd left. Imogen ran a company that made personalized wellness experiences for corporate clients. Retreats in Tofino, cold plunge programs, curated supplements with names that sounded like chakras. She had 47,000 followers on Instagram and a newsletter called Becoming Grounded, and the specific fluency of someone who had learned that if you talked about vulnerability long enough, people stopped noticing you were never actually vulnerable. She called Elspeth her inspiration. Her elder. She brought flowers, always peonies, always slightly past peak, the kind that photograph beautifully and die fast. She posted photos with captions about the wisdom of older women. Elspeth didn't dislike her. She was too experienced to dislike something she hadn't fully measured yet. Margot watched. Real affection has friction. It disagrees. It forgets things. It laughs at the wrong time and can't stop. Imogen's affection was seamless. Every gesture was placed precisely. Every expression arrived on cue. Margot had worked with enough families in crisis to recognize the difference between love that was clumsy because it was real, and love that was perfect because it was performed. Her grandmother used to say, "Be careful of people who are too good at caring. It means they've been practicing." Day 13. Margot was returning from a pharmacy run in Dunderov. She came in through the mudroom the way she always did, so as not to disturb Elspeth's afternoon reading. The house was quiet. Then she heard Imogen's voice from the sitting room. "Lo, careful. The way you talk when you don't want sound to carry." Margot stood still. She heard, "There are excellent care facilities in Langley. Sutton's been looking. After the wedding, there won't be room here for the same setup. He won't say it himself. You know how he is. But I'll help him see it. You'll have your garden books. You'll have your own space. It'll be better for everyone." She heard Elspeth's voice, smaller than Margot had ever heard it. "I don't want to go to a facility." She heard Imogen's voice, flat and patient, the way you'd explain something to a child who wasn't quite understanding. "Then don't make this difficult. The doctor comes next week for the cognitive assessment. It would help Sutton enormously if the picture was simpler, if you'd been having some confusion." She heard Elspeth's voice, barely. "I haven't been having confusion." She heard Imogen's voice. "I know. But Sutton doesn't need to know that." Margot stood in the mudroom holding a paper pharmacy bag. Her hands were bloodless around the handles. Her face was still. She walked into the kitchen the long way, made noise unpacking the medications, waited until she heard Imogen's heels on the front tiles, waited until the door closed. She made Elspeth tea. She brought it to the sitting room without saying anything about what she'd heard. Elspeth held the mug with both hands. Her knuckles were white. She didn't say anything either. Neither of them did. Sometimes understanding passes between two people without language. The way cold passes through glass. You feel it and you don't name it, and you both know anyway. Day 17. Margot was helping Elspeth with her morning routine when she saw it. On the inside of the upper arm, just below the sleeve line, a bruise in the particular purple of a recent grip. 3 distinct points. Not the diffuse yellow-green of a bump. The specific geometry of fingers. Elspeth pulled the sleeve down. She said, "I caught it on the chair arm." Margot said, "Chair arms don't leave that pattern." Elspeth looked at the window. Margot said, "I worked palliative care for 2 years. I've seen every kind of bruise." Elspeth said, "It's not what you're thinking." Margot didn't push. She finished the morning routine and noted it in her own personal record. Date, location, description. the same way she'd been trained to do in her second year of nursing school by a supervisor who'd told her. The chart is for the hospital, but your notes are for yourself. Keep them separate and keep them precise. She'd been keeping her own notes since day 13. Day 20. Elspeth's reading glasses disappeared. She didn't notice right away. She thought she'd misplaced them, which wasn't entirely unlike her. She moved them constantly, to the side table, the windowsill, the arm of the chair. But one day passed, then 2, then 3. And Margot searched every surface in the solarium and the bedroom and came up empty. Elspeth couldn't read without them. Not the case law, not her email, not the notes she'd been drafting for a land rights conference she'd been asked to address via video call. She sat in her chair in the mornings with the books closed in her lap and stared at the garden. Margot found them on day 23, at the back of a drawer in the guest suite, a room Imogen used when she stayed over. They were folded under a stack of decorative linens, wrapped in a face cloth, not lost, placed. Margot cleaned them with the hem of her shirt. She brought them to the solarium and knelt beside the wheelchair and put them on Elspeth's face the way you handle something you know matters, carefully, without ceremony, because ceremony can embarrass the thing it's meant to honor. Elspeth blinked. The room sharpened. She said, very quietly, "Thank you." That night, in her room at the end of the hallway, Margot sat on the edge of her bed and updated her notes. She didn't let herself think too far ahead yet. She just wrote down what she'd seen. Date, location, description. The care of a woman who understood that documentation was a form of protection. Day 25. A Saturday afternoon in October. Margot was in the kitchen. She heard it from 2 rooms away. A short, cut-off sound. Not a scream. The kind of sound a person makes when they've been hurt and they've already learned not to make a bigger sound. She walked to the solarium. The door was half open. Imogen was standing beside the wheelchair. Her foot was on Elspeth's hand. Not her heel, the ball of her foot, the weight shifting forward. Elspeth's hand was flat on the armrest, fingers together. Imogen looked up at Margot. Her expression didn't change. The smile came instantly, complete, like it had been waiting off stage. She said, "Margot, I was just fixing the blanket. It slipped." Margot looked at Elspeth's hand, at Imogen's foot. At the distance between them, she said, "I need to speak with Elspeth now." Imogen left. Margot crouched beside the wheelchair and took Elspeth's hand in both of hers. 2 fingers were swelling already. She got ice from the kitchen, wrapped it in a cloth, held it gently against the hand. Neither of them spoke for a moment. Then Elspeth said, "Don't tell Sutton." Margot said, "Elspeth," she said, "she'll have me declared incompetent. She's been working toward it for months. She found a private doctor. She told him I've been confused. She's building something, and if you give her a reason to move faster, she'll move faster." Margot said, "You're the sharpest person I've met in 3 provinces. Elspeth said, "It doesn't matter what I am, it matters what he believes I am." Margot wrapped the ice carefully. She didn't argue. She thought about what she'd been collecting since day 13, the notes, the dates, the bruise on the arm, the glasses in the drawer, what she'd overheard in the mudroom, and she thought about the difference between evidence and testimony and what happened when you had both. She said, "She's not smarter than you," Elspeth said. "I know." She said, "She's just more willing to go further. That's different." Elspeth looked at her. She said, "Don't leave me alone with her." Margot said, "I'm not going anywhere." Day 30. Margot knocked on the door of Sutton's home office. He was on a call, but she waited in the hallway until she heard him hang up. She went in and told him everything. Not rushed. Methodically. The conversation she'd overheard. The bruise. The glasses in the drawer. The hand. She had her notes with her and she put them on the desk in front of him. Printed, dated, chronological. He listened. He didn't interrupt. His face was the careful face of a man hearing something he didn't want to hear. When she finished, he said, "This is a serious accusation," she said. "I know." He picked up his phone. He called Imogen. Margot sat across from him and waited. Imogen arrived in 20 minutes. She was already crying. Not in the way grief produces tears, but in the way preparation does, clean and calibrated. She held her phone out and showed Sutton photos. Herself and Elspeth at the kitchen table. In the garden in summer, Elspeth smiling, Elspeth laughing. Each image precisely chosen. She said, "I love her. Why would anyone say this?" Sutton went to the solarium. Margot followed. Imogen followed. Sutton crouched in front of his mother's wheelchair, too low, the way people crouch when they think they're being gentle but they're just being patronizing, and he said, "Mom, Margot says Imogen has been hurting you. Can you tell me if that's true?" Elspeth's eyes moved from Sutton's face to Imogen. Imogen was standing just behind him, expression composed into grief and confusion and warmth. Her eyes said something that only Elspeth and Margot could read. "The facility, the doctor, the papers. Say what you always say." Elspeth looked at her hands. She said, "Margot's mistaken. Imogen has been very good to me." Sutton stood up. He turned to Margot. He said, "My mother has answered. If you make an accusation like this again, the agency will be notified." He left. Imogen followed. She looked back at Margot from the doorway. The tears were gone. What was underneath was smooth and empty and utterly unbothered. Margot stood in the solarium alone with Elspeth. Elspeth looked at her lap. She said, "I'm sorry." Margot sat down beside the wheelchair. She said, "Don't be sorry, be angry." She said, "I'm 80 years old. I'm tired of being angry." Margot said, "Then let me be angry for both of us." She took Elspeth's wrapped hand in hers. The room was very quiet outside. The garden gone amber in the afternoon. She didn't leave. She had no reason to leave. That was stronger than the reason to stay. She kept the notes, added to them, kept the dates precise. Sutton began to change without knowing it was happening. He stopped in the hallway one evening in November and heard his mother's voice. Not the flattened voice Margot had found when she arrived. Not the one that ended sentences before they were finished. But the full professor's voice. The one that had held 300 students in a lecture hall and hadn't lost the thread once. He stood in the doorway and watched. Elspeth and Margot were arguing about whether a 2018 federal court ruling should have gone further. Elspeth was winning, but barely. He stood there for almost 4 minutes. Then he walked away without saying anything. 2 days later, in the kitchen, he said to Margot, "She seems different." Margot said, "She's the same. She just has somewhere to put it now." He said, "What do you do with her?" She said, "I argue with her. I read with her. I make her tea when she wants it and don't when she doesn't. I ask her what she thinks and then wait for the actual answer instead of the answer I expected." He was quiet. She said, "You ask her how she is, she says fine, and you leave. That's not a visit. That's an attendance record." Nobody said that to Sutton Crane. Not lawyers, not contractors, not the people who worked for him in an office with his name on the door. He had no answer. That night he went to the solarium. He stayed for an hour and 10 minutes. Not 10 minutes. More than an hour. When he came out, his face was different in a way Margot couldn't quite name. The way a room looks different after someone opens a window. Imogen noticed the shift before Sutton did. Elspeth was speaking more, laughing more. Sutton was staying longer. The edges of the plan were getting complicated by a 79-year-old woman who was becoming, visibly, undeniable. She tightened things. She limited Margot's access to certain rooms. She canceled the physiotherapist Margot had arranged, a woman from Burnaby who'd done wonders with Elspeth's shoulder, and replaced her with someone Imogen chose herself. A quiet man who asked no questions and reported back to no one anyone could verify. She watched Margot more closely, and Margot watched her watch. Day 42, a Wednesday, 3:17 in the afternoon. Elspeth found her voice. Imogen had come by in the afternoon. Sutton wasn't home. Margot was in the laundry room at the end of the hall with the door open, folding sheets, listening. Elspeth said, clearly, "I'm going to tell Sutton the truth. All of it. He's been sitting with me. He's been hearing me. He's not who he was 2 months ago, and when he sees me clearly, he'll see you clearly." Imogen's voice went flat. The warmth drained out of it like water from a tub. She said, "No, he won't." And then, the sound, sharp, unmistakable. The sound of an open hand against a face, hard enough to turn a head. And then the sound of something small hitting marble. Margot was down the hall in 4 seconds. She came through the doorway. 3 frames. First, Imogen, standing over the wheelchair. Hands still raised, face completely still, not angry, finished. The expression of someone who has just completed a task. Second, Elspeth, head turned from the impact. Left cheek beginning to rise, eyes open, looking at the window, looking at nothing. Third, Elspeth's reading glasses on the floor. One lens cracked. Margot looked at the glasses. She looked at the cheek. She looked at Imogen's face, that complete blankness. Something in her resolved. Not rage, not calculation, a reflex. The same one that makes you put your arm out in a car before your brain knows why. 3 steps. Her right hand open, not a fist, something older than anger. The reflex of someone built by years of sitting at bedsides at 3 in the morning. by learning the weight of a body that couldn't hold itself, by knowing, in the cellular way you know things you were never taught, that the only thing separating a vulnerable person from what wants to harm them is someone who refuses to step back. Her palm connected with Imogen's cheek. Imogen went sideways, caught the side table, went to her knees. Margot stood between the wheelchair and the woman on the floor. Her hand was stinging. Her career was probably over. She didn't move. She said, "Don't touch her again." Behind her, Elspeth looked at Margot's back with an expression that had no category in ordinary feeling. The expression of someone who had stopped expecting anyone to come and then watched someone come anyway. Sutton walked in 30 seconds later. Imogen was already speaking. She'd gotten to her feet. The tears were there, immediate, professional. She said, "She attacked me. I was visiting your mother and she hit me. Out of nowhere." Sutton looked at Margot. Margot said nothing. She stepped to the side but didn't leave the space between Imogen and the wheelchair. He looked at his mother. Elspeth looked at Imogen. She looked at the expression on Imogen's face, the choreographed grief, the eyes that said what they always said, the doctor, the facility, the papers, say what you always say. And then she looked at Margot. Gray scrubs, white sneakers, still breathing hard, still standing exactly where she'd stood. Someone came. Elspeth said, "She slapped me, and before today." The room went still. She said it again, steadier. "Imogen slapped me. And it wasn't the first time. She grips my arms. She hid my reading glasses for a week. She stood on my fingers. She turned my wheelchair to face the wall and left me there for an afternoon. She told me. She said after the wedding, Sutton would put me somewhere, and she'd make sure he believed I was losing my mind." Imogen shook her head. She said, "Sutton, she's confused." "The doctor already," Sutton said. "She just described a pattern of conduct over 6 weeks in precise chronological order. That is not confusion. That is testimony." He looked at Imogen for a long time. He said, "Get out." She said, "You're choosing a nurse over me?" He said, "I'm choosing my mother." He said, "I should have been choosing her for 2 years." Imogen left. Her heels on the marble were the only sound. Then a door, then gone. She wasn't finished. At 6:41 that evening, Imogen called the police from her car in a parking lot in Kitsilano. She gave them an address and a description and said that a personal care worker at the property had physically assaulted her. The report was accurate in the way a photograph of a single moment is accurate. It didn't lie, it just removed context. Margot was questioned. The agency was notified. Her nursing registration was flagged pending review. Imogen contacted a journalist she knew who ran a local news site and gave her the outline. Wellness entrepreneur assaulted by home care worker, possible immigration complications, more to come. The comments appeared within hours. Margot read them on her phone in her room at the end of the hallway. She didn't shake. She'd worked with dying people. She'd learned that fear is loudest when the outcome is still undecided, and that fear is survivable, and that what you do while you're afraid is the only thing that ends up mattering. Sutton knocked on her door. He said, "I've spoken to a lawyer." She said, "You don't have to do that." He said, "I want to." He said, "What you did, I should have done that. Months ago. Not the hitting. I mean, I should have been there." Margot said, "You're here now." He said, "I need to show you something." 2 years earlier, when the house had been renovated, Sutton's contractor had installed a security system with interior cameras. Common areas only, he'd insisted at the time, more for the art than anything else. The footage uploaded automatically to a private server. No one had looked at it in months. He hadn't remembered it existed until the lawyer asked about documentation, and something at the back of his memory surfaced. He watched 6 weeks of footage alone. His office was dark except for the monitor. He watched Imogen move through the house when Elspeth was alone. He watched her reach into the drawer of the guest suite and place the reading glasses under the linens, fold the facecloth over them, close the drawer. Careful, deliberate. A task, not an impulse. He watched her take the handles of the wheelchair and turn it to face the wall. He watched Elspeth grip the wheel rims and try to turn herself. She couldn't manage it alone. She tried twice and gave up. And he watched her sit there for 3 hours and 40 minutes with the Vancouver skyline shining through the window behind her, while she stared at white paint. He watched Imogen step onto his mother's hand on a Tuesday afternoon. He watched his mother's face, the single sound she made, cut off immediately, and he watched Imogen's expression. Not cruelty, not anger. Boredom. the blankness of someone removing an inconvenience. He heard the threats, clear audio. There are excellent care facilities in Langley. He heard his mother's voice saying please. He heard it again on a different day, and again. Then he watched Margot. He watched her find the glasses in the drawer, clean them with her shirt, carry them to the solarium, kneel and place them on his mother's face. He watched his mother's eyes focus. He watched her bring the wheelchair around from the wall. He watched the light hit his mother's face and his mother blink slowly, like surfacing. He watched Margot open the curtains wider and hand Elspeth her book without a word. He watched Wednesday evenings, Margot sitting beside the wheelchair with a book of her own, not talking, just present, just there. He watched the afternoon of day 42 3 times. The third time he noticed something he'd missed. After Imogen fell, after Margot had said what she'd said, Margot's hands were shaking. Her whole body was shaking. She was afraid. She planted herself in front of the wheelchair anyway, and she stayed. He called his lawyer. He called a private investigator. He asked questions he should have asked earlier, about Imogen's background, her financial situation, a business deal that had stalled the year before his mother's health had declined, an insurance policy, 2 documents Imogen had drafted that were found in a folder on her cloud drive that she'd shared with Sutton for a renovation project 18 months ago, and never removed his access from. He sat with it for a day. They told Elspeth together. In the solarium by the window, Sutton sat across from her. Margot stood nearby, not intruding, not leaving. Sutton said, I should have seen it. Elspeth said, you saw what she wanted you to see, he said. That's not an excuse. She said, no, it isn't, but I'm not interested in blame right now. Tell me what you found, he told her. She listened the way she'd always listened, not moving, barely breathing, processing the professor's attention. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, I want this to be public. Sutton said, Mom, she said, I spent 2 years being managed and minimized and made smaller, and I want people to know what it looks like. I want other people to see it. She said, I want Imogen to know that I know. She said, and I want the world to know that the woman who stopped it was wearing gray scrubs and white sneakers, and did it because she has the kind of hands that don't let go. She insisted on attending the press conference herself. That was not a negotiation. Fresh wheelchair cushion, the good one. Her white hair brushed and pinned. New reading glasses. Margot had found an identical pair within 24 hours of the old ones breaking, because Margot had been paying attention to what Elspeth needed before Elspeth had to ask. The room was full of cameras expecting a real estate story. Sutton opened. He said, 3 weeks ago, my mother's personal care nurse struck my partner. Media reported it as an unprovoked attack. I'm here to show you what actually happened. The screens activated. The agency's lawyer had been there. The college's investigators had been there. Everyone had been there. The room watched the footage in silence. The glasses placed in the drawer. The wheelchair turned to the wall. The 3 hours and 40 minutes. The foot on the hand. The whispered conversations in the sitting room. The assessment forms, pre-filled. The facility letter, drafted and addressed and waiting. Then, Margot finding the glasses. Margot turning the chair, Margot sitting in the evenings. Margot's hand shaking planted between the wheelchair and the woman on the floor. Then the afternoon of day 42, the slap, the glasses spinning. Margot crossing the room. The gasps in the room were audible. Sutton said, there's more. He presented the documents, the investigator's report, the timeline. Then Elspeth rolled to the center of the platform. She was 79 years old. Her glasses were straight. Her voice was the voice that had held lecture halls. She said, my name is Dr. Elspeth Crane. I taught environmental law at the University of British Columbia for 26 years. I am not confused. I am not declining. I am a woman in a wheelchair who was told to be quiet or lose everything. She paused. She said, I'm speaking today because a young woman who came to this city with a backpack and a reference letter chose to fight for me when I had run out of fight. She had no obligation to do it. She had every reason not to. She did it anyway, because she knew what these hands were for. She looked to the side of the room. Gray scrubs. White sneakers, eyes red. Not crying. Not yet. Elspeth said. Margot Hale stood between me and the woman hurting me, and I've spent my whole life in rooms full of brilliant people, and she is among the finest I've ever known. The charges against Margot were reviewed and dropped within 72 hours. The footage was that clear. Imogen's company went quiet within a week. The Instagram went private. The newsletter stopped. Imogen was charged. Elder abuse. Fraud. The investigation was ongoing. Her lawyer issued a statement. Margot didn't read it. The comments on the news coverage shifted. Protect her. She was right. She did what anyone should have done. Margot read some of them, not all. She was busy. 3 weeks later, a Tuesday morning, the solarium, West Vancouver, the lamp on, the window full of late autumn light, the mountains across the inlet, half shrouded in cloud the way they get in November, which is not sad but just the mountains being honest about the season. Elspeth was reading aloud from a land rights case that had come down the week before. Her voice was full and unrushed and filled the room. Margot was in the chair beside her, not a nursing chair, not positioned for observation, just a chair, pulled up close, with her own book open in her lap. She wasn't reading, she was listening. She didn't understand every citation. She didn't need to. Sutton appeared in the doorway. He'd started doing that, appearing in doorways instead of walking past them. Elspeth had noticed. She'd mentioned it to Margot one morning with the smallest possible smile, like it was a fact she was being careful not to enjoy too openly. He said, "I'm making coffee. Margot, do you want some?" Elspeth turned a page. She said without looking up, "She takes it with 1 sugar and she doesn't need you to make it for her, but she'll say yes if you ask again nicely." Sutton said, "I wasn't asking nicely." Elspeth said, "You were asking like you run a company," she said. "Try again." Sutton looked at Margot. He said, "Would you like coffee? More like an offering." Marg said, "I would, thank you." He disappeared down the hall. Elspeth kept reading. Her voice was steady and precise and absolutely her own. Outside the window, the inlet was flat and silver, and the mountains held their cloud, and the garden had gone brown at the edges, the way gardens do when they're done for the year, but not finished. Just resting, biding, saving something for spring. Margot sat beside her and listened. She had come to Vancouver with a backpack and a reference letter, and the precise knowledge of what it means to stand between someone and the thing trying to erase them. She hadn't come looking for a fight, but she hadn't looked away from one either. That's all it ever is. Seeing what's in front of you clearly, and deciding that what you do next is the kind of person you want to have been. Strong hands don't need a reason. They just need a moment, and then they hold on.